He boarded the flight like anyone else, quiet, respectful, holding a small pet carrier. But from the moment he took his seat, something felt off. The looks, the skipped service, the way the flight attendant spoke to him, then asked him to do the unthinkable, in front of everyone. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice, he just did exactly what they asked, and quietly made a decision that would change everything. By the time they landed, she had no idea who was sitting in seat 2B, or what he had already set in motion. Stay with this video, because what this man uncovers next will leave you stunned. And the truth? It was hidden in plain sight all along. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss one. Jaron Coleman moved quietly through the boarding gate, holding the soft carrier that held his cat, Marley. His coat was neatly pressed and his steps were steady, but his eyes showed the same tired caution that had grown in him over the years. It was supposed to be a simple flight from Boston to San Francisco. Seat 2B in business class, meal pre-selected, pet cleared with Airline weeks ago. Everything was in order. The woman at the boarding door gave his ticket a glance and waved him in with a flat, "You're all set." No eye contact, no welcome. Jaron didn't mind. He was used to it. He walked down the aisle slowly, the low buzz of passengers finding seats all around him. As he reached his row, a slim, pale woman with sharp eyes and a tight blonde bun turned to look at him. Her name tag said Callie R. Her smile was stiff, too fast, and gone just as quickly. She said nothing. She looked at the carrier and raised her brow for half a second before stepping aside to let him through. Jaron nodded politely, as he always did. He slid into his seat and tucked Marley's carrier gently under the one in front. The cat didn't make a sound. 2 rows ahead, a white couple had already been offered drinks, champagne, warm towels, friendly chatter. Jaron sat quietly, waiting. Nothing came. The same attendant walked past him twice, offering no tray, no napkin, no drink. A second flight attendant passed, greeting 2 white businessmen behind him by name. Jaron noticed. He always noticed. But he didn't react. He leaned his head back against the seat and took a slow breath. He hadn't taken a vacation in almost 6 years. This wasn't even a vacation, it was business. But he'd decided to bring Marley this time. The cat had been with him since his wife died, and he didn't like leaving her behind. He'd done everything by the book, paid the fee, filled the forms, got approval. And yet something felt off already. He looked out the window. The runway lights blurred slightly through the glass. The hum of people settling in faded around him. He didn't know it yet, but the cold looks and small silences on this flight were only the beginning. Something was building, something quiet, and it would shake more than just the cabin. About 15 minutes before takeoff, Jaron reached down to check on Marley. The cat stirred gently inside the carrier, her golden eyes blinking up at him. She was calm, like always. He whispered, "You good, girl?" and gave the carrier a small pat. Just then, Callie appeared beside his seat. Her arms were folded, and her expression was tight. "You'll have to remove the animal," she said, voice flat. Jaron looked up slowly. "Excuse me?" Callie motioned to the carrier with a small nod. "We've had a few concerns already. That cat can't be here." Jaron sat up straighter. "This is Marley. She's my emotional support animal. She's cleared through the airline. I submitted everything weeks ago. I have the email right here." He reached for his phone, but she shook her head. "I'm not going to argue about it," she said, forcing a smile. "The rules say animals can't disturb passengers, and I've already had a complaint." Jaron blinked. She hasn't made a sound. "I'm just doing my job, sir." He felt the sting in that word, sir, spoken with clipped politeness like a blade tucked behind manners. Passengers nearby turned slightly, pretending not to listen while leaning just enough to catch what was happening. One man peeked over his newspaper. No one said a word. Jaron looked down at Marley's quiet face, then back at Callie. "You want me to get off the plane?" She smiled again, this time wider. You can fly without the animal or catch the next one. It's your choice." Jaren didn't move for a second. His hands were steady, but something inside him pulled tight. "Fine," he said quietly. "I'll take her off." He stood up slowly, lifted the carrier from beneath the seat, and walked down the aisle. The silence around him felt louder than any shouting. No one stopped him. No one questioned it. Not even the crew. Just eyes avoiding his. As he stepped past first class toward the front, a middle-aged supervisor with silver hair finally looked up from his tablet. "Is there a problem, sir?" Jaren gave a quiet nod. "They told me my cat isn't allowed, so I'm stepping off." The man glanced toward the back, confused, then shrugged. "We'll handle it on the ground." There was no apology, no effort to help, just procedure. Jaren didn't argue. He never did. He simply followed the hallway back into the jet bridge, carrying the one thing that kept him steady in this world, now being treated like luggage. He didn't raise his voice. But something inside him was shifting, quietly. At the gate, Jaren stood in front of a glass-paneled service desk while a young staffer clicked away at a keyboard. Her badge said Natalie, and she didn't meet his eyes. Behind her, the hallway buzzed with other agents scanning tickets and chatting softly into radios. No one looked at him directly. Jaren set Marley's carrier gently on the floor beside his feet and waited. Natalie finally spoke without lifting her head. "They flagged your animal. Cabin disturbance." Her voice was flat, mechanical. "There was no disturbance," Jaren said quietly. "She didn't even move. I submitted documents weeks ago. She's an ESA. Cleared, confirmed. I have the approval letter from your airline." He pulled up his email and turned the screen toward her. She gave it a brief glance and shrugged. "Well, it's already logged in the system. The cabin crew marked it, so we have to follow that. I can put you on the next flight if you leave the cat behind. Or you can reschedule for tomorrow with pet clearance again." He stared at her. "Leave her behind, like a suitcase?" Natalie didn't reply. Jaren looked down at Marley. Her head poked out slightly through the soft mesh. Her eyes met his. She was quiet, always had been. She never clawed, never cried, not even during long flights. His wife used to call her the therapist in fur. That memory came like a ripple in his chest. This was supposed to be a routine flight. He said more to himself than to her. Still, Natalie didn't look up. She was already typing something else. A short, balding man in a suit appeared beside the desk. His tone was rehearsed. "Sir, we can store the animal in our climate-controlled pet facility until you retrieve her at the destination airport. She'll be safe. It's standard." His name tag read, "Mike, Flight Supervisor." Jaren's jaw tightened. Safe for who? She doesn't understand this. She's not a suitcase. Mike's expression didn't change. "I understand this is inconvenient, but we're on a tight schedule. We can't hold the plane." Jaren looked past both of them, through the wide windows, at the plane still waiting at the gate. The same plane he was supposed to be on. Seat 2B. Meal ordered. Ticket paid. Cat cleared. Still, this was how he was treated, like he was in the wrong for even being there. He had the urge to argue, to ask for someone higher up, to demand fairness. But he didn't. Not because he was afraid, but because he had been here before. Different place. Same silence. Same fake politeness. Same unspoken message. "You don't belong here." He knelt beside Marley's carrier and unzipped the side slightly. He ran his hand along her back. "It's just a few hours, girl. I'll see you on the other side." Then he stood up, handed over the carrier, and watched them wheel her away without another word. Not even a tag. No smile. No apology. As he reboarded the plane, passengers were already adjusting their seatbelts. Callie stood near the galley, laughing at something the pilot had said. When she saw Jaren, her expression didn't change. No surprise, no guilt. She simply stepped aside and nodded toward his seat like it was nothing. Jaren said nothing. He walked slowly down the aisle, returned to 2B, and sat down. The seat was still warm. A folded paper napkin sat untouched on the tray table, like a placeholder. No drink. No welcome back. He leaned back and stared straight ahead, hands resting flat on his lap. Inside, his chest felt hollow, like someone had quietly carved out part of his dignity and no one had noticed. Or maybe they had, and they just didn't care. The plane began to taxi, and the engines rumbled softly beneath the cabin floor. Jaren sat motionless in his seat, his hands clasped gently together as if holding something fragile. The space next to his feet felt empty now, too empty. He had always kept Marley close during flights, not just for comfort, but because she made the silence feel less hollow. She had been there when no one else was. Tonight, that silence felt heavier than ever. He turned his head slightly, watching Callie stroll past with a stack of menus in her hand. She paused by the couple in 2A and 2C, smiled brightly and asked, "Would you like to look over the meal selections again, or are we still good with the grilled sea bass and the lamb?" Her tone was soft, almost playful. The man in 2C laughed and tapped the menu. "Sticking with the lamb, thanks, sweetheart." Jaren turned back to the window. The lights on the runway glowed like distant stars beneath a glass surface. His reflection looked tired, not from the day but from something deeper, something layered, like this wasn't the first time and it wouldn't be the last. He tried to push it down, tried to tell himself not to take it personally. Maybe Callie was just having a long day. Maybe the airline system was to blame. Maybe the man in the front office just didn't have the authority to help. Maybe. But he'd played that game before. He'd made those excuses for others too many times. When he was 27, sitting in a boardroom with two white men who kept calling him the guy from IT, even though he was the one who built the entire architecture. When he was 34, waiting outside a conference while the keynote speaker, a man who had once worked under him, walked right past without recognition. When he was 49, denied access to the VIP lounge because the desk clerk didn't believe his card was real. He had let all of that slide, always thinking, "Stay quiet. Don't make a scene, keep moving forward." He'd swallowed it each time, smiled through it, worked harder, rose higher. And yet here he was, again. Same system, different paint. Callie walked past his row again. No eye contact. She gave an extra long smile to the man in 3A as she poured his wine. Then finally she stopped by Jaren's seat. No tray, no meal, just a lukewarm bottle of water handed wordlessly. He accepted it with a small nod, but his jaw tightened. He waited a beat, then spoke calmly. "I pre-selected my meal when I booked, the salmon with brown rice. Did it not show up?" She blinked once. "Oh, I think we ran out. Sorry. I can check, but we're mostly down to chicken wraps." She said it like it was no big deal, like it wasn't part of something larger. "That's fine," he said quietly. She gave a quick nod and walked off. No effort, no apology. He watched her go, then let his eyes drift across the rows. Everyone else had silverware, real plates, linen napkins folded into neat triangles. Jaren's tray table remained empty. It wasn't the food. It never was. It was the dismissal. The way she looked past him. The way she only became attentive once she was speaking to someone who looked like they fit in business class. The way his quiet presence, his pressed clothes, his clean shoes, his paid ticket, none of it mattered, because he didn't look like the others. And somewhere someone had decided that was enough reason to treat him differently. He took out his phone, scrolled briefly through his inbox, and paused on an old message. A calendar alert. Board meeting, Sky Unity Holdings, Monday, 10 a.m. He stared at it for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the screen. No one on this flight had any idea who he really was. Not the crew, not the passengers. Certainly not Callie. He could have said something, he could have told them. But Jaren had learned something over the years. True power wasn't loud. It didn't bark back. It didn't try to win arguments in real time. True power stayed quiet. It observed. It remembered. And when the time came, it acted. He put the phone away, folded his hands again, then closed his eyes and leaned back against the headrest, not to rest, but to let the weight of the evening settle fully. He had felt this kind of weight before. It always meant something was about to shift. And it would, just not the way they expected. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft gold, casting a quiet glow across the seats. It should have felt peaceful, like the beginning of a long, relaxing flight. But for Jaron Coleman, everything felt cold. Not because of the temperature, but because of what had already been taken from him. Not the meal, not the pet, something else, something harder to name. He stared down at the untouched water bottle resting on his tray table. The label was peeling at the edge, and the condensation dripped slowly down its side. A small, insignificant object. But at that moment it felt like a mirror, clear, plain, and easily overlooked. Just like him tonight. From his peripheral vision he saw Callie step into the galley again, this time laughing lightly with the co-pilot. The sound of her voice, casual and free, grated against the silence pressing down on him. She moved like someone who had never questioned her place, like someone who knew her words would always be taken at face value. That kind of ease, Jaron had never known it, not once in his 55 years. He shifted slightly in his seat, feeling the tug of something deep in his chest. It wasn't rage, it wasn't sadness. It was closer to weariness, the kind that seeps into your bones, like trying to walk through water while everyone else is running on dry land. He thought back to Marley, now sitting somewhere alone in a sterile holding room. That cat had been more than a companion. She had been his tether, a link to his wife, Claudine, who passed 4 years ago after a long illness. Marley had curled beside her hospital bed every single night, as if she knew the weight of grief before it even arrived. Losing Claudine had been like the earth cracking open beneath his feet. Marley helped him cross the gap, and now, because a stranger didn't like the look of him, or the quiet animal at his feet, she had been taken away. Not with cruelty, but with indifference, and that was worse. Cruelty at least you could name. Indifference wore a smile. It wrapped itself in airline policies and checklists, and it never left fingerprints. He opened his tablet, not out of boredom but out of habit. His fingers moved across the screen with mechanical familiarity. Most of the passengers around him were watching movies or dozing. No one noticed that his screen didn't show a film, but a login panel protected by biometric security. He placed his thumb on the scanner. The screen blinked once, then opened. A dashboard appeared, quiet and sterile. But behind its simple layout sat the control panel for something much larger. Sky Unity Holdings, one of the most discreet but powerful entities in the aviation sector. Investors, data, assets, internal operations. Jaron was not just a shareholder. He was one of its founding architects. He tapped through to the employee behavior tracking system. A search bar appeared. He typed, Callie R., Flight 708. Her profile came up with a photo, staff ID, route history, and a list of recorded interactions. There were notes, small but telling. Passenger dissatisfaction, February 2023. Tone complaint, September 2022. Service inconsistency flagged by fellow crew, December 2021. Each incident dismissed. Each one labeled insufficient evidence. Jaron's eyes scanned the data slowly like a surgeon reading a chart before a critical operation. His face gave nothing away, but his mind was already writing something. Quietly, sharply, like ink on glass, he tapped one more tab. Initiate silent ethics flag. The button pulsed, asking for confirmation. He hesitated. A part of him still wondered if this was necessary, if maybe he was overreacting, if maybe he was too tired, too sensitive, too everything. These were the questions that had been burned into him from years of being the exception in every room. Doubt, for men like him, didn't just whisper. It echoed. But then he remembered the way Callie looked at him. Not with hate, not with fear, with something else. Dismissal. The way someone looks at a broken seatbelt light or a jammed snack drawer. A minor inconvenience. Not worth remembering. And that was the problem. They never remembered. Because people like Jaron were expected to take it, nod politely, and fade back into the silence. That's what they'd always counted on. He tapped confirm. Then he set the tablet aside, folded his hands again, and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but to wait. Because now the system would start to turn. Quietly, efficiently. And when it did, it would remember everything. Not in anger, not in revenge, just in truth. The cabin lights dimmed further as the plane reached cruising altitude. A hush settled in, broken only by the soft hum of the engines and the occasional clink of glass from the galley. Jaron Coleman remained still, his eyes half open but not focused on anything in particular. The seatbelt sign had turned off, and a few passengers moved about, stretching legs or adjusting pillows. Around him, the atmosphere felt peaceful. To anyone else, this was just a routine flight, but inside Jaron something else was unfolding. Quiet, deliberate, and deep. He could feel it in the space between his breath and his chest, in the hollowness where Marley should have been. That empty space next to his feet, the quiet rustle she made when shifting inside her carrier, it was gone. And the silence left behind wasn't peaceful. It was unsettling. He looked around slowly. A couple across the aisle was sharing a dessert. One man nearby had already reclined his seat and was snoring softly. Another, in 3C, flipped through a Wall Street journal without looking up. Everyone here was settled in their own small worlds. No one looked his way. And maybe that was the part that always hit hardest. Not the rudeness, not the insult, but the complete absence of acknowledgement. It was the invisibility. He turned his gaze back toward the front of the cabin. Callie stood with her back to him, leaning slightly over the drink cart, laughing quietly with a dark-haired pilot who had come out from the cockpit. She had her hand resting on the cart handle, fingers tapping gently as if she had all the time in the world. Her tone was casual, carefree. Jaron stared, not with hate, not even with anger, but with the kind of steady, exhausted recognition that comes from decades of repetition. He'd seen this before. She was the type who knew she could make a decision that affected someone's day, maybe their dignity, and still smile 5 minutes later like nothing happened. Because for her, it was just policy. Just a moment. Nothing lasting. For him, it was another wound added to a long list he'd stopped counting. His tablet still sat in his lap, dark screen reflecting the overhead light. He tapped it back on and opened the secure report form. He didn't need to type much. The system would autofill based on the data logs already captured. AI-enabled cabin monitoring, facial interaction logs, and audio flagged by keyword detection. Tools meant to improve elite customer experience. Tools no one on this plane knew he had access to. He paused again. Jaron had spent most of his adult life building things. Platforms, companies, internal systems. His goal was always to make things cleaner, better, fairer. He had never wanted to use that power against people. But sometimes, silence became a form of approval, and he had stayed silent too many times. Callie moved through the rows now, checking on select passengers. She knelt next to a white man in 1A, smiled as she handed him a glass of something dark and expensive, then laughed at something he said. Her posture softened when speaking to him, shoulders down, tone light, hands folded neatly. Jaron watched every gesture. The way she leaned in, the way she nodded as if she genuinely cared. But when she passed him again, no smile, no question, no glance. Just walked by. Not even a glance at his empty tray table. Not even an offer. It wasn't what she did. It was how little she thought he mattered. He clicked submit. The report vanished into the system. No noise, no alerts. But it would move. Algorithms would read it. Names would be flagged. Profiles reviewed. He closed the tablet. Jaron leaned back in his seat and placed both hands on the armrests. His fingers were still steady, though the weight in his chest had grown heavier. Not with sadness, with certainty. The kind that comes when you've done everything right, followed every rule, and still ended up in the same place you started, unseen. In his head he could hear Claudine's voice. She had always warned him, being right won't protect you. But staying silent won't save you either. She had known this world. She had lived it too. Callie passed by one more time. This time she hesitated, maybe sensing something. But when she looked down at him, her smile never came. Just a polite nod, the same kind she'd give a stranger in line at the bank. He gave her a small smile, not out of kindness, but out of clarity. He wasn't angry. He was prepared. The soft blue cabin lights cast a calm glow as dinner service began. Rows ahead, the quiet sounds of utensils clinking and glasses tapping filled the air. Steam rose gently from real plates, and the scent of roasted lamb, seared salmon, and warmed bread passed slowly through the aisle like a private invitation, an invitation Jaron Coleman had not received. His tray table remained down, but still empty. No cutlery, no cloth napkin, no plate, just a water bottle, now room temperature, and a tightly wrapped moist towelette placed without eye contact an hour ago. It sat unopened beside the tray's corner like a reminder, not just of what was missing, but of what had been decided. He heard Callie's voice 2 rows behind, light and smooth. "Would you like the Merlot with the lamb, Mr. Dennings, or should I bring the Pinot again?" Her tone was different now, friendly, accommodating, as if the earlier scene with Jaron had never happened. Jaron didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had learned a long time ago that you didn't need to see cruelty for it to hurt. Sometimes it came wrapped in courtesy. In this case, wrapped in napkins and poured into crystal glasses. He folded his hands together on his lap, slowly, carefully, like everything inside him had to be kept still or it would break apart. He thought of Marley again, thought of how she always stared back at him with those wide, round eyes that seemed to say, "I see you." When Claudine had passed, it was Marley who kept the house from falling silent, who jumped onto the bed at night, pressing against his side like a small heartbeat reminding him he was still here. And now she was sitting somewhere, alone and confused, because one flight attendant didn't bother to ask a single question. Jaron's jaw tightened. It wasn't that they'd taken her away. It was that they acted like it didn't matter. Behind him, someone laughed too loudly. The sound jarred him slightly. Then came another voice, 2 seats over. "The cat guy still sitting there?" Thought he left. A chuckle. Then quiet again. Not because of shame, but because in this space people like Jaron weren't expected to take up room. They were supposed to endure, quietly. He had sat in this silence before, when he was the only black man in a corporate retreat at a ski lodge in Vermont, when he waited outside a country club boardroom for a meeting only to be mistaken for the driver, twice, when he was denied entry to a private lounge even though he'd funded half the infrastructure that powered the airline. Every time he had smiled, every time he had said, "It's fine," and every time it wasn't. His fingers tapped lightly on the armrest now. Not a rhythm, just motion. Quiet, steady motion, like a clock counting something down. He leaned forward slightly, opening his tablet once more. This time, he accessed the live passenger service report feed. Flight 708, business class section. Every action recorded, every minute tracked. He found the timestamp, passenger Coleman J. meal request, confirmed selection, herb roasted salmon, brown rice, spring vegetables, submitted 6 days ago. Confirmation code, verified meal, status not served, flight crew, comment, none logged. He stared at it for a moment, then looked over to the man in 2C. Steak, a glass of red, dessert menu already placed. That man had boarded after him. No pre-selection, but somehow he'd been prioritized. He scrolled again. Callie R's service record. 4 flagged notes, 2 from passengers with names like his. None had been investigated. He closed the tablet, set it gently aside. The quiet burned deeper now. But it wasn't shame, not anymore. It was resolve. He wasn't going to stand up, wasn't going to raise his voice or call for the manager. He wouldn't record anything, wouldn't storm down the aisle, wouldn't post it online for likes and outrage. Number Jaron had something else, something stronger. He had the system, and unlike the flight attendant who dismissed him, He knew exactly how to use it. Not tomorrow, not next week. Now he reached for his watch, tapped the screen 3 times. The display lit up with a pale green glow. A prompt appeared. Activate behavior trace. Cabin 2B, linked to employee ID 77543. He tapped yes, then leaned back calm. Nobody around him noticed. Nobody even looked. But beneath the silence, beneath the dim cabin lights and the clinking of cutlery, a storm had already begun. And it wasn't loud. It was built with precision. The kind of precision that didn't need to shout to change everything. The sky outside the plane window stretched on like a sheet of darkness, endless and quiet. Clouds passed like ghosts beneath the wings, invisible to the people tucked into their warm, reclining seats. Somewhere over Nebraska, the cabin had settled into its post-dinner lull. Dim blue lights glowed from the aisle floor. A baby cried faintly several rows back. The clink of wine glasses had slowed to a whisper. Jaron Coleman sat still, eyes unfocused, but wide open. Sleep wasn't coming. It never did when something inside him was unfinished. He shifted in his seat, slow and careful. The kind of movement a man makes when carrying too many thoughts in too little space. His body was still, but his mind moved fast. For most passengers on this flight, tonight was just another long-haul journey. Something to get through, something routine. But for Jaron, something about this night felt heavier. And it wasn't just because of Marley, or the meal, or Callie. It was something older, deeper. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small item wrapped in soft cloth. Unfolding it carefully, he revealed a silver pen. Not just any pen. Claudine had gifted it to him on his 40th birthday. For signing things that matter, she'd said, smiling in the way only she could. He held it now like it was an anchor. Cold, familiar, real. His gaze returned to the back of the cabin, where Callie moved between seats again. Her pace had slowed, less performative now. Maybe she'd noticed something. Maybe not, but he caught her glance toward him this time. Brief, almost instinctual, but her face gave nothing away. She walked on. Jaron looked down at the silver pen resting across his palm and thought about the weight of doing nothing. About how many times he had convinced himself to let things slide. Not because he lacked courage, but because he had been trained, by life, by experience, to pick his battles. But now, sitting in seat 2B, stripped of a meal, stripped of respect, stripped of his quietest comfort, he realized something. Every time he had let it go, the cost hadn't disappeared. It had just shifted onto someone else, onto the next quiet man in the next seat, onto the next woman asked to move, the next child told to wait, the next family told, it's just the rules. He breathed slowly through his nose. Long inhale, longer exhale. He tapped the watch again. Link behavior traced to internal oversight. Yes, no. He tapped yes. A second screen opened. Authorized contacts. Internal ethics chain. He selected 3 names. One was an executive director of service operations. Another oversaw regional compliance. The third, chief executive officer of the holding group. He didn't write a message. He didn't need to. The flagged profile and automated incident footage, captured by onboard cameras, filtered by service response AI, would speak for itself. Every clipped interaction, every skipped offering, every recorded discrepancy between how others were served and how he was not. And yet even then, he hesitated. What if it caused more than he intended? What if Callie was just tired or new or following some flawed internal protocol? He asked himself the same thing he always had in moments like this. What if you're overreacting? But deep inside, another voice answered, one that sounded a little like Claudine's and a little like his younger self. And what if you're not? He set the pen down gently on the tray table. He didn't want Callie punished. He wanted the pattern broken. He wanted this plane to be the last time someone like him had to sit quietly, while the world moved around them like they weren't there. He wanted someone, somewhere in the chain, to stop looking away. Suddenly the seatbelt light flickered back on. A light jolt shook the cabin. Mild turbulence. Callie's voice came through the speaker, chirpy but measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll resume service shortly." It was the same tone she'd used earlier, cool, unaffected. But now Jaren listened differently, because he knew something she didn't. This wasn't turbulence. This was the quiet start of an audit, a review, a reckoning, not fueled by outrage but by quiet records and patient action. And while she floated through her shift, unaware of what had already begun, Jaren closed his eyes, his hands resting lightly on the pen, and finally allowed himself to breathe. Not from relief, but from knowing that silence would no longer be the end of his story. It would be the start of someone else's lesson. The cabin had grown still. It wasn't just the hush that came after dinner or the lull that follows cabin announcements. It was a deeper stillness, the kind that feels like waiting, not for arrival, but for something unseen to unfold. Jaren Coleman kept his eyes closed, but his mind didn't rest. Sleep had not come for him in years without a fight, and tonight he didn't bother pretending. His thoughts stayed sharp, weaving between memories and decisions. The pen still lay across his tray table, simple, heavy, symbolic. He opened his eyes slowly, his gaze drifting toward the small overhead screen showing the flight map. They were somewhere over Colorado now. 3 more hours until landing. He wondered what Marley was doing in that moment. Whether someone had checked on her, whether she was cold, whether she was scared. That thought hit harder than expected. He imagined her curled in the corner of a metal crate, ears twitching with unfamiliar sounds. A gentle animal, punished for being quiet in the wrong place. And yet, as painful as that image was, it was painfully familiar. Because he knew what it felt like to be calm, prepared, and compliant, and still be made to feel like a threat, or worse, like a mistake. He looked toward the front of the plane. Callie wasn't in sight. She was probably in the galley, resetting trays or chatting with other crew members. He pictured her wiping down surfaces, maybe laughing about some rude passenger from a past flight. He wondered if she even remembered what she had done earlier, or if it had already disappeared from her mind, like a task crossed off a list. People like her rarely saw the aftershocks. It was people like him who carried them. He folded his hands again and rested them over his stomach. For a moment, he thought of his father, a man who had worked in the post office for 40 years and never once took a sick day. A man who wore a pressed shirt every Sunday even when they didn't go to church, because you never know when someone's watching. That kind of discipline had lived in their family like religion. You work hard. You stay polite. You never let them say you didn't deserve your place at the table. But no matter how hard they worked, that table still felt like it had corners marked off for others. Places already claimed by birth, by skin, by the silent approval of gatekeepers who didn't even know they were gatekeepers. Jaren exhaled through his nose and tapped the edge of the tray with 2 fingers. Slow. Steady, a rhythm that helped him think, a way to stay grounded. He opened the tablet again, but not to read, not to log anything. He opened a blank document. He began to type, not a complaint, not a report, just thoughts, sentences that came without effort. She looked at me and saw no value, not hostility, not disgust, just nothing. That's how they keep it clean, by pretending we're not there. He paused, deleted the last line, rewrote it. That's how they keep us quiet, by convincing us we don't count. He didn't know what he would do with the words. Maybe nothing. Maybe he'd send them later. Maybe he wouldn't. But writing them helped, because naming the wound was the first step in healing it, and in holding those responsible. A soft vibration on his wrist broke the moment. He looked down at his smartwatch. Status update. Flag ID 77543. Trace active behavior monitoring initiated. Cabin data synced. Internal alert. Confirmation pending legal review. He stared at the notification. It was emotionless, mechanical. and yet it carried more weight than any raised voice could. He knew how this would play out. First, a digital footprint review. Then, a cross-check of service times and crew packs interaction levels. If anything matched the existing flagged patterns, prior complaints, crew performance reports, it would move higher. Fast. He didn't want anyone fired. That wasn't the point. But if she was protected by a system, she should also be held accountable by it. That's all he'd ever asked for. Not special treatment, just equal gravity, equal weight. He cleared the screen and shut the tablet. Somewhere behind him, someone laughed too loudly at a movie. Another person coughed. The plane continued across the darkened country, unaware of the quiet shift happening mid-air. And that was how it always worked, wasn't it? The world spun forward like nothing had changed, but something had. Because this time, the one in seat 2B hadn't stayed silent. He had simply waited long enough for the system to start speaking for him. 2 hours remained until landing. The sky outside was still black, but lighter shades were beginning to pull at the edges, hinting at dawn somewhere far ahead. Most passengers were asleep now, draped in airline blankets, heads tilted toward windows, or slumped against neck pillows. The kind of silence that felt deep and padded had settled over the cabin. Jaron Coleman sat upright, fully awake. His eyes were dry but not tired. His mind was alert, sharper than it had been all day. The air in the cabin was cool, recycled. He could hear the soft whir of it through the vents. Everything around him was calm, but only on the surface. Beneath that stillness, tension sat inside him like a stone. He had replayed the day in his head more than once now. Each time the same question returned. Why did she target me? He knew the answer, of course. It wasn't about a cat. It wasn't about policy. It was about how invisible he looked to her. He could feel it in the way her voice clipped short around him, the way she made assumptions and never questioned them, the way she enforced rules she bent for others. And yet, part of him still asked, what if I'm wrong? What if she was just careless? What if I'm reading too much into it? He hated that feeling, the self-doubt carved into the ribs of people who've spent a lifetime being treated like background. He didn't want to ruin someone's career. He didn't want headlines. But he also couldn't carry another quiet insult without pushing back. Not anymore. Not after everything he had built. Not after what Claudine sacrificed. Not after every door he had to knock on twice just to be allowed to stand in the same room. He glanced down at the pen again. It caught the low cabin light and shimmered faintly. It looked like nothing special to anyone else. Just a pen. But to him, it held every moment where he had chosen silence when he could have spoken. Every time he had backed down because he didn't want to confirm the stereotype of being too sensitive, too defensive, too difficult. A flight attendant moved quietly down the aisle, handing out warm towels. Not Callie. Another one, softer in presence. She reached Jaron's row and paused. For a moment, he thought maybe she would skip him too. But she stopped, leaned forward slightly, and held out a towel with both hands. "Would you like one, sir?" she asked. Her voice was kind, not overdone, just sincere. He nodded. "Thank you." Their eyes met for only a second, but in that second, something passed between them. Acknowledgement. Not the kind that fixes everything, but the kind that tells you someone somewhere sees the weight you carry. As she walked on, he placed the towel in his lap. The warmth surprised him. It reached deeper than expected. Still, it didn't undo what had happened, and it didn't stop what was now unfolding. He tapped his watch again. Trace status. Confirmed. Behavior logs uploaded. Response pending from oversight lead. He leaned his head back and stared at the curved ceiling of the cabin. Behind the gentle lighting, wires hummed. Systems blinked, and decisions began to form. He imagined the people in those offices who would soon receive the logs. Legal teams, ethics officers, maybe even someone from the airline's C-suite. They wouldn't see his face, they wouldn't hear his voice. But they'd see the timeline, they'd see the pre-order that was ignored, they'd see the interaction clips, the service logs, The moment a compliant man was told to get off the plane without reason, and they'd have to answer for it. Not to him, to the truth. He let his eyes close, not to sleep, but to listen, to the creaks of the plane, the soft breathing of strangers, the thump of his own heart. He wasn't angry, he wasn't even bitter. He was just done. Done carrying the weight of staying quiet so others could stay comfortable. Done wondering if dignity was something he had to earn over and over again in every new space. Done accepting that being treated like an inconvenience was just part of the deal. If there was a cost for speaking without raising your voice, he would pay it. With calm, with truth, with precision. Because power didn't always speak first. Sometimes it waited, and when it spoke, it didn't ask for permission. It simply said, "I was here, and I didn't deserve this." And that was enough to shift everything. The hum of the plane seemed louder now, not because it had changed, but because there was nothing left to distract from it. No announcements, no service carts, no idle chatter, just the long, steady vibration of a machine gliding through dark sky, carrying strangers and stories toward an arrival they would all experience, but not equally. Jaron Coleman stared out the window. His reflection stared back, quiet, thoughtful, older than he felt a few hours ago. The faintest tint of blue began to leak across the horizon. Morning wasn't here yet, but it was starting to press against the edges of the night. His thoughts were heavier now, not frantic, not overwhelmed, just weighted by the kind of reflection that didn't come often enough. His body sat still, but inside, he was walking through rooms he hadn't entered in years. He remembered his first flight in business class. He'd been 31, fresh off a deal that took years to close. He had dressed sharp that day, tie straight, shoes polished, documents tucked in a slim leather briefcase. But when he stepped onto the plane, the flight attendant had looked at him, then at his ticket and asked him, twice, "Are you sure this is your seat?" He hadn't gotten angry. He had smiled, nodded, sat down, and then stayed quiet. That was always the move. Stay quiet. Be polite. Don't confirm their assumptions. Prove them wrong with grace, not force. It had been his survival tactic for decades. But now, in seat 2B, watching the first shades of daylight press against the clouds, he wondered, who had that really protected? Not him. Not the next man, certainly not Marley. His jaw clenched lightly. He hadn't realized he was grinding his teeth until his molars ached. He loosened his shoulders and exhaled. Long and slow. He reached down and adjusted the towel still draped over his lap. The warmth had faded, but something about its presence grounded him. A rustle came from across the aisle. The man in 2C stirred, adjusting his blanket, then yawned loudly. He glanced at Jaron, eyes groggy. "Man, they didn't feed you?" he asked, motioning toward the empty tray. Jaron looked at him. The voice wasn't mocking, just blunt, unfiltered. "No," Jaron said quietly. "Apparently they ran out." The man frowned. "Seriously? I got my plate and I booked late. I didn't even pick a meal." Jaron gave a short nod. "That's what they told me." The man shook his head, a low whistle escaping his lips. "That's messed up." And just like that, the silence shifted. Not by much, but a crack had opened. Someone else had noticed. Someone else had spoken it out loud. Jaron didn't reply, but something settled differently in his chest. Not relief, not validation. Just a faint, steady pulse of clarity. The kind you get when a truth, one you've carried alone, finally echoes back from someone else's mouth. Another vibration on his wrist. He looked down. Alert. Oversight lead response. Flag ID 77543. Case acknowledged. Emergency behavioral review initiated. Jaron's eyes stayed on the screen. Below that line, another followed. Legal and compliance will review cabin logs upon landing. Crew advised of internal evaluation. And then, in smaller text, partner executive flagged for priority review. He sat back, eyes open, mouth closed. There would be no announcement, no apology over the intercom, no sudden shift in tone. The world didn't change like that, not here, not mid-air. But change had begun quietly, and that for him was enough. Across the aisle, the man in 2C had already fallen back asleep, but the words he'd spoken still hung in the air like a thread, a single sentence that acknowledged the wound. Jaren reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a photo, creased at the edges, small enough to fit in his palm. It was of Claudine, standing in their backyard, Marley tucked under one arm, the sun washing both of them in gold. He had carried this photo for years, never told anyone. He looked at it now and smiled, just faintly. Not out of happiness, out of respect. "I did what you taught me," he whispered under his breath. "Stay calm, stay smart, and when the time is right, let the truth speak." He folded the photo and placed it back in his pocket. He didn't need to explain himself to anyone. The truth had already begun its work. The captain's voice broke through the silence like a soft knock on a closed door. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our initial descent shortly into San Francisco. Please return to your seats and ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened." There was a small shuffle of motion across the cabin. Blankets were folded, seats adjusted, windows lifted. Call buttons clicked softly in a few rows. But Jaren Coleman didn't move. He was already upright, already ready. And yet something inside him stirred, like a quiet alarm going off not from fear, but from knowing. The kind of knowing that comes when a long, slow wait is finally about to lift. He reached for his seatbelt, clicked it into place, and rested his hands on his thighs. Outside the window, city lights sparkled far beneath them, scattered like stars pulled down from the sky. The plane began to descend, and with it came a slight drop in his chest. Not the physical kind, the other kind. The one that comes when you realize you're about to re-enter a world that doesn't know what just happened at 37,000 feet. Jaren watched the clouds roll past the wingtip. The sky had gone from inky black to a pale steel gray. Daylight was crawling in slow and cold, like a fact no one could ignore. Footsteps approached. He didn't turn his head. He didn't need to. It was Callie. She stopped beside his row. Not beside him, just close enough. Her voice was lower now, no chirp, no rehearsed warmth. "Mr. Coleman," she said softly. He turned his head slowly, looked at her. Her eyes didn't hold the same firmness as before. There was something else now, uncertainty, hesitation, maybe even discomfort. "I wanted to let you know, your animal will be waiting in the pet services area," she said. "They said she's fine." Jaren didn't reply at first, he just watched her. Her hands were clasped in front of her, knuckles tight. "That's all?" he asked, calm, level, not sarcastic, just honest. She blinked. "Excuse me?" "I asked," he said. "Is that all you came to say?" Callie hesitated. She glanced toward the galley, then back at him. "Yes, sir. I just wanted to make sure you knew." There was an awkward silence between them, tight and thick, like air in a room that hadn't been opened in years. Jaren gave a slow nod. "Thank you for letting me know." Callie didn't move. He turned his head away again, eyes back on the window. She stood there another second, then walked off without another word. And that was the most telling part. She hadn't apologized, not because she wasn't capable of it, but because she wasn't ready to see what she had done. Maybe not yet, maybe not ever. And that was the thing about people like her. They thought harm required shouting, slurs, or visible cruelty. But what she had done wasn't loud. It was quiet, polished, woven into her tone, her choices, her indifference. And that was exactly why it had gone unchecked for so long. Until now. Jaren exhaled slowly. It wasn't victory, not exactly, but it was the beginning of something bigger than vindication. It was accountability, the kind that moved slowly through systems, the kind that couldn't be talked down by a smile, the kind that didn't need him to speak twice. He reached into the seatback pocket and pulled out a clean napkin, folded it once, then again, then held it in his hand like a final act of calm. The plane dropped again, gentle but firm, and the city grew larger through the clouds. He thought about the people waiting at the airport, not for him, but for someone. Maybe a family reuniting, maybe a couple coming home, maybe someone who would walk past Marley's crate without knowing she belonged to the man in seat 2B. He thought about what would happen in the next hour. Callie would be approached, quietly, formally. A file would open, a record would grow. Not because he had raised his voice, but because he hadn't. Because silence, when documented, when tracked, when proven, had its own sound. And it was louder than anything she'd said all night. As the landing gear lowered, he placed the napkin on the tray table. Folded, neat, clean. A small symbol of everything she thought he didn't deserve. And yet, here it was, waiting. Just like him. The wheels hit the tarmac with a firm, echoing thud that vibrated through the floor and up into Jaren's spine. The cabin jolted slightly as the brakes caught, and for a brief moment, everyone around him seemed to wake up from whatever floating daze they'd been in. Heads lifted, blankets pushed aside, seatbacks clicked upright. The slow, sleepy choreography of landing began. Jaren didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the window, where dawn now pressed in fully. Pale orange streaks breaking through low clouds, the city below glowing soft and quiet. San Francisco, home for some, business for others, just another stop for most. But for Jaren, this arrival wasn't just physical. It felt like a shift inside his chest, a crossing of some invisible line, not dramatic, not loud, but lasting. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the announcement started again. A thank you from the captain, a reminder to check the overhead bins, a final smile in the voice of the crew. Everything perfectly routine. But for Jaren, nothing about this flight had been routine. He sat still, hands gently folded in his lap, watching his reflection fade as the cabin lights brightened. Around him, passengers stretched, reached for their phones, checked notifications. A woman across the aisle was already on a video call, whispering excitedly about a wedding she'd be attending that weekend. Her voice faded in and out of his awareness. His mind wasn't here. It was already down that jet bridge, walking through what would happen next. A clipboard would be waiting at the gate. He could feel it. He knew how these things worked, not because someone had warned him, but because he was the warning. Across the airline's network, someone had already pulled up Callie's name, not because of who he was, but because of what the data showed. And that's what made it real. Not his feelings, not his story, the evidence. That was what made the walls move. He looked down at the folded napkin still resting on the tray. It sat untouched, crisp and silent, like a symbol of everything that had been denied to him. Not just the meal, but the basic dignity wrapped inside it. The meal wasn't the pain. The message it sent was. A voice came over the intercom again. Flight attendants, prepare doors for arrival. He heard footsteps behind him, then beside him. Callie stood at the front of the cabin doing her final checks. She smiled at the older gentleman in 1C, said something about the weather. Then she looked over the rest of the rows with the professional detachment of someone trained to offer hospitality without connection. Her eyes brushed past Jaren's brow. But this time, something in her expression changed. A slight pause, barely a second. Then she moved on. Jaren didn't react. He didn't need to. The time for that had passed. The plane came to a stop at the gate. A soft ding signaled the release of seatbelts, and passengers immediately rose to grab bags, stretch their legs, nudge their way toward the aisle. Jaren stayed seated, not because he was waiting to be dramatic, because he didn't need to rush. People pushed forward, eager to be first off, unaware that the real story of this flight was still unfolding. Jaren finally stood, adjusted the collar of his blazer, and picked up his tablet and coat. He moved slowly, deliberately, stepping into the aisle when it was clear. His movements were quiet, calm, but inside, something steady pulsed through him. This wasn't pride. It wasn't revenge. It was clarity. He stepped into the jet bridge. The air was cooler here, sterile. The hum of the terminal reached his ears as the glass doors slid open. Two men in dark suits stood near the end of the walkway, holding tablets. No name tags, not security, not customer service, corporate. The man on the left looked up, met Jaren's eyes, and gave a slight nod. "Mr. Coleman," he said quietly, with a tone that balanced respect with awareness. Not fear, not performance, just recognition. Jaren returned the nod. "Is she here?" "Yes, sir. Pet services team has her ready just ahead." The second man didn't speak. He simply stepped aside as if clearing a path. Not out of deference, but because something in the air had shifted. Jaren walked past them without another word. He could hear the soft clicks of the crew deboarding behind him, could feel the glance Callie might cast his way once she realized the men weren't waiting for just anyone. She might not know what this meant. Not yet. But she would. Not because he told her, not because he filed a complaint or raised his voice in the aisle, but because somewhere in her file, in a quiet office behind the scenes, a chain of decisions was beginning. A process was moving, and this time she would be the one asked to explain herself, not out loud, but where it counted. As Jaren stepped into the terminal, the morning light spilled across the polished floor. The city had woken up. Planes taxied. Announcements echoed overhead. People rushed past with coffees and phone calls and tight schedules. He moved against that current, steady, still. Somewhere ahead, Marley was waiting. And when he reached her, he wouldn't say anything dramatic. He'd unzip the carrier, run his hand along her back, and whisper the same thing Claudine used to say to them both when the world tried to fold them small. "You're safe now. I see you." And this time the world would have no choice but to do the same. The terminal was bright in a way that felt unnatural. After so many hours in dim cabin lighting, polished floors reflected the early morning sun spilling through tall glass windows, and the soundscape had shifted completely. No longer the muffled tones of crew announcements and whispering passengers, but the sharp clatter of rolling luggage, soft-soled shoes against tile, and the rhythm of airport life waking up. Jaren Coleman walked slowly, his pace unhurried, his steps deliberate. He moved through the crowd like a man who belonged there, because he did. But even in this open space, he carried the weight of the flight behind him. It wasn't in his posture, he stood straight, but in his breath, in the way his eyes scanned without urgency, as if they were still watching more than looking. He passed a coffee stand where a young man behind the counter laughed too loudly, and for a second, Jaren felt like an outsider in someone else's morning. People clutched paper cups and rushed past him, already on their next call, next gate, next obligation. None of them knew what had happened on Flight 708. None of them knew what was coming behind him, but he did. Ahead, a glass-walled room stood near the corner of the terminal. A small sign above the door read, "Pet Services. Arrivals only." It was quiet inside. Calm. A woman in a navy vest stood at the desk, checking a clipboard. As Jaren approached, she looked up, and her expression shifted almost immediately, politeness giving way to something warmer. "Mr. Coleman?" she asked. He nodded. "She's ready for you." The woman stepped out from behind the desk and led him down a narrow hallway, her voice soft and measured. "She's been very quiet. Didn't make a sound the whole time. The staff checked on her every hour. She didn't eat, but she drank a little water." Jaren's throat tightened. "She doesn't eat when she's anxious," he said, barely above a whisper. The hallway opened into a quiet holding area. The lights were low, the walls pale blue. And there she was, Marley, in her carrier. Still curled in a tight circle, her small face resting on one paw, eyes half closed. When she heard his voice, just a single word softly spoken, her head lifted, slow but sure. He knelt down beside the crate, unlatched the front and opened the door. She didn't leap out. She never did. Instead, she stretched slowly, then stepped forward and nuzzled against his hand, as if to say, "I knew you were coming." Jaren swallowed the tightness in his throat. The woman standing nearby smiled and looked away, giving him privacy without saying a word. A quiet kindness, He scooped Marley up in his arms, her body light and warm against his chest, her heartbeat fast but steady. He closed his eyes for a second, pressing his cheek gently against the top of her head. The texture of her fur, the scent of her, the small familiar things, brought him back to center, as if all the noise, the dismissal, the eyes that refused to see him could be put back in their place. This moment belonged to him. He turned to the woman. "Thank you for taking care of her." She nodded. "Of course, sir. She's a sweetheart." Jaren smiled faintly, the first time his face had fully softened since boarding the flight. He walked out of the holding room and back into the terminal, Marley tucked safely in her carrier against his side. His pace had changed, no longer tense, but grounded. He passed the same coffee kiosk, the same swarm of passengers now deeper in their morning. But something had shifted. He was no longer walking away from something. He was walking toward what came next. As he moved through the terminal, he caught sight of a familiar figure standing near a side corridor, one of the dark-suited men who had waited at the gate, the one who had said his name. The man gave him a nod, then held up a tablet, turning it just enough for Jaren to see. A single line glowed across the screen. Crew member debrief initiated. Ethics lead notified. Full review underway. No other details. No names. No drama. Just the truth, in motion. Jaren gave a slight nod in return. No words passed between them. None were needed. That was how real systems moved. Without show, without sound, but with force. He continued on, boots clicking softly against the tile, his eyes fixed ahead. Marley shifted gently in the carrier, her head resting near the mesh side, her gaze steady. The sun was rising now, clear and gold through the high windows. Planes moved across the runways like shadows come to life. The airport was fully awake, buzzing with new stories that would board, fly, and land, all unaware of the quiet storm that had passed just hours before. And somewhere behind him, a file was growing. Not because he had raised his voice, because he hadn't let theirs silence him. Not this time. Outside, the morning sun had broken cleanly across the tarmac. The chill in the air still held on, but the golden light softened it, filtered it into something gentler, something like peace, though Jaren Coleman wasn't sure he'd call it that yet. He stood outside the terminal now, waiting for his car service, Marley's carrier resting gently at his feet. She was calm again, breathing slow, her eyes blinking in the rhythm of trust. She hadn't made a sound since he picked her up. She didn't need to. Just being near him again was enough. It always was. Jaren looked down at her through the mesh. "We're all right," he said quietly. "We made it through." But the truth was, it wasn't just about this flight, not really. It was about every flight, every hotel, every restaurant, every conference, every room he had walked into where someone, somewhere, made the silent calculation that he didn't quite belong. Too brown, too old, too quiet, too composed to be powerful, too polite to ever push back. He'd carried that weight for years, folded neatly inside smiles beneath tailored suits, inside firm handshakes that came a beat too late. But something had shifted now. Not in the world, no. The world was still the same machine it had always been. But he had shifted, and that mattered. The sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. The driver stepped out, nodded, and took his luggage. As Jaren opened the back door, he paused and looked back at the terminal glass. Behind those walls, the woman who had dismissed him would soon sit in a room with questions she couldn't dodge, a video she couldn't explain, a record that didn't care about her intentions, only her actions. And maybe, for the first time, she would realize what it felt like to be made small without warning. Maybe she wouldn't, but it no longer mattered whether she learned or not. The story was already out of her hands. As he settled into the back seat and pulled Marley's carrier gently into his lap, his phone buzzed. A new email. From an internal alias used only for high-level communications at Sky Unity Holdings. He didn't open it. Not now. He didn't need to see the report to know what it said. It would be filled with terms like inquiry, compliance breach, mandatory retraining, service bias, all the correct words, all the careful phrasing. But behind those words lived something more important. A shift in the record. A red line drawn where before there had been none. And that was how real change began. Quietly. Permanently. The driver asked, "Hotel or straight to the office, sir?" Jaren looked out the window. The sky was clean now. No clouds, just air and space and light. "Take me to the marina," he said after a pause. "There's a coffee spot there. By the water." "Of course." The car moved off, slipping into traffic like a thread through fabric. Jaren leaned his head back, eyes half closed, and thought of Claudine again. Not in a painful way, not anymore. He pictured her standing by the porch they used to sit on, hands on her hips, smile tilted sideways. He imagined telling her the story, how calmly he had handled it, how he hadn't flinched, how he had trusted the system he helped build to speak on his behalf. She would have said, "Took you long enough." He would have laughed, because she always saw him clearly, long before others learned how. He looked down at Marley. "We're going to sit by the water for a while," he said. "Then we'll go home. Nothing dramatic, just quiet." And that was the final word the day deserved. No speeches, no public call-outs. Just a man, his cat, and a quiet kind of justice that had taken too many years to arrive, but came anyway. Not with noise, but with truth, with proof, and with a folded napkin on a tray that would never be forgotten. This wasn't just a story about being dismissed. It was about quiet strength, silent injustice, and the power of not staying silent anymore. If this story touched you, please give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real, powerful stories like this one.